The wind curled low and mournful through the hills that evening, carrying the scent of rain and something older, the kind of storm that doesn't just break over land, but settles into it, seeping into the soil and the bones. Mara Jensen stood on the porch of her small, weather-beaten cabin, watching the dark clouds roll over the Texas plains like an angry sea. The last light of day was fading fast, and the sky above twisted with shades of charcoal and deep bruised purple. Her dog, Boone, growled low at her feet, ears perked toward the east. She'd lived here alone for nearly 7 years, just her, Boone, the wind, and the long echo of a life once shared with a man whose name she no longer said aloud. The hills were quiet country, cruel and beautiful, and they'd hardened her in ways city folks wouldn't understand. She didn't mind. She didn't need anyone, or so she believed. The first sound came faint and strange, hoofbeats, distant but sure, not the hesitant approach of a lone rider or the reckless charge of bandits. These were steady, strong, and many. Mara stiffened. Boone barked once, sharp and uncertain. From behind the hills, 7 riders emerged, shadows at first, their silhouettes blurred by sheets of rain and dust. As they drew closer, she saw them clearly, tall men on massive horses, their hair long, their clothes soaked and clinging, adorned with bone, leather, and war paint now streaked by rain. Comanche. Mara's breath caught. Her hand drifted to the rifle resting just inside the doorframe. She didn't move to grab it, but she didn't move away either. The riders halted a few yards from her porch, silent as statues beneath the storming sky. The wind screamed around them. One dismounted, taller than the others, with silver streaks in his braids and the bearing of someone who answered to no one. He approached slowly, hands open at his sides, not empty, but not threatening either. His dark eyes found hers without flinching. "We seek shelter," he said, his voice gravel wrapped in thunder. "The storm takes no sides." Mara studied them, their tired horses, the soaked leather, the exhaustion that clung to them like the rain. These weren't raiders. They were travelers. And even if they weren't, 7 men could have taken what they wanted from one woman, yet here they stood, asking. She nodded once, slowly, and stepped back from the doorway. Boone growled low but stayed put. "There's room in the barn for your horses," she said. "Dry clothes by the fire, if you don't mind, and worn and patched." The leader bowed his head, not deeply, just enough to show respect. "We mind nothing but the cold," he said, then turned and signaled the others. The 6 behind him dismounted without a word. They moved like water, quiet, assured, always watching. One of them, younger than the rest, gave Mara a brief glance. His gaze lingered a second longer than the others, but he said nothing. They led their horses toward the barn as lightning split the sky behind them, casting long, flickering shadows across the hills. Mara closed the door, bolted it, and leaned against it for a breath, heart pounding louder than she wanted to admit. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. And something deep inside her, something she thought had long gone quiet, stirred. The cabin was thick with the scent of smoke and wet earth. Mara moved briskly, tossing kindling into the hearth until the fire caught with a hungry crackle. The walls creaked under the wind's weight, and water hissed as it dripped from the riders' soaked clothes onto the wooden floor. The Comanche stood in near silence, eyes scanning every inch of her home, not with greed or suspicion, but the wary attentiveness of men who had survived too long in a world that rarely offered kindness. They hadn't spoken much since entering, and neither had she. Words weren't needed, not yet. The leader, whose name she still didn't know, had positioned himself closest to the door, as if he intended to leave at any moment. The others sat near the hearth or stood against the walls, forming a loose, quiet circle that left no corner unaccounted for. Mara handed out old wool blankets and dry shirts, garments that once belonged to her husband, folded and stored away in a trunk she hadn't opened in years. The men accepted them with nods and murmured thanks in a language she didn't understand. One of them, older and scarred, whispered a few words to the younger one who had looked at her before. He listened, then moved toward the door. Before Mara could speak, the young man slipped back outside into the wind and rain. She frowned, turning to the leader. "What's he doing?" He answered without looking at her. "Helping." "Helping who?" "Your animals," he said. "The wind is pushing the barn door open. Your dog couldn't stop it." She moved quickly to the window, squinting into the storm. There, in the dim lantern glow from the barn, she saw him, the young one, hauling hay, fixing the latch, and calming her jittery mare with slow, deliberate movements. Boone circled nearby, no longer barking, just watching him. Mara blinked. Most men she'd known wouldn't lift a finger unless asked, and none of them ever moved that quietly. When he came back inside, his long black hair was plastered to his face, his shirt clinging to him. He didn't speak, just dropped a bundle of dry kindling by the hearth, then stepped back into the circle of warriors. Mara stared for a moment too long, then busied herself with the stew pot, ladling out thick spoonfuls of beans and dried meat simmered in pepper and smoke. She handed bowls around. The silence held until the first bites were taken. Only then did murmured words pass among the men, soft, slow, measured. The fire crackled, casting flickers of light across their faces. One man, heavy-set, scarred from chin to brow, began humming under his breath. A strange, rhythmic tune. Another joined in. Not a song, really. More like the bones of one. Something ancient and far from here. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, something softer had settled. An understanding, an agreement of sorts, unspoken but solid. Mara leaned against the table, watching them. The young man, the one who had helped with the animals, sat near the fire, his legs stretched out, eyes half-lidded with fatigue. His gaze met hers again, not bold, not shy, just steady, curious. He didn't smile, neither did she, but something passed between them. She didn't know his name yet, but already, she felt him slipping into the quiet spaces of her mind, like the first warm day after a brutal winter. Not enough to thaw anything fully, but enough to make her remember that things used to bloom. The storm outside hadn't let up. Thunder rolled like distant cannon fire, low and slow, shaking the walls of the cabin as if reminding those inside that nothing was permanent. Not warmth, not shelter, not peace. The wind screamed across the plains and clawed at the window shutters, but the fire in Mara's hearth burned steady now, casting long shadows that danced across the worn floorboards and the weathered faces of the 7 men who had taken refuge under her roof. They hadn't spoken much, not even among themselves. But now, with bellies full and boots drying by the fire, a shift began, subtle, like the lifting of a heavy fog. The older warrior with the scarred face sat nearest the fire. He reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in doeskin. From it, he took a pipe, simple, carved bone stem, the bowl dark with use. He didn't speak, just began the slow ritual of packing it, fingers deliberate. One by one, the others watched. The room was quiet save for the crackle of flame and the occasional spit of sap bursting from the logs. When he lit the pipe, he took a deep pull, then handed it to the man beside him. No words, just an offering, and a passing. It moved around the circle until it reached the leader, then the younger one, the one with the quiet eyes who'd gone out into the storm for her animals. Mara stood behind her table, arms crossed, leaning slightly on one hip. She didn't ask questions, she hadn't offered judgment, that had earned their silence, and now, perhaps, their stories. The leader looked over to her. His voice was low, made rough by time and sand. "We've come far," he said. "Too far to remember what it feels like to be welcome." She tilted her head. "You think this is welcome?" He gave a slow shrug. "It is not rejection. That's rare enough." Mara said nothing, just studied him. His eyes held a tired wisdom, not unlike the way the sky looks before a storm breaks. She saw the scars at his temple, the way his fingers twitched every time a log cracked too loud. He turned to the others and said something in Comanche, a short phrase. They glanced at each other, then back at him. He gave a small nod. The heavy-set man with the pipe spoke first. His English was rough, but clear. He told of their flight. Driven from land after land, hunted not only by soldiers but by other tribes who had bent to treaties. No place to stop, no ground left that didn't demand blood or surrender. Another chimed in, quieter, with a sharpness in his voice. He had lost his brother to smallpox delivered in a blanket. Another lost a son in the snow, buried where no stone could mark him. Their voices were slow, almost reluctant, like men unaccustomed to saying these things aloud. But the cabin, warm and small and strange in its gentleness, seemed to allow it. Then the young one spoke. Mara hadn't heard his voice before. It was smooth, not deep, but firm. He told of his mother, how she had fled with him as a child, her husband already dead, her people scattered. How she'd raised him on stories and bitter roots, and how he had buried her at dawn beneath a cottonwood tree she'd once prayed under. He didn't cry, neither did Mara, but her throat closed around something hard, and she didn't look away. She moved slowly to the fire, sank down across from him, knees pulled to her chest. Her hair was loose now, and the firelight caught in the strands. She looked at the young man, then at the rest. "My husband died over a fence line," she said. "One argument too many with the man next door. They called it a land dispute. Shot him clean through the chest, then shook my hand at the funeral." The words hung in the air, brittle as old wood. No one answered, but the silence now was different, not empty, but filled with something shared. The storm outside had settled into a steady drumbeat against the roof. In the quiet, Mara rose and stepped to the door. She opened it just a crack and breathed in the cold night air. It smelled of sagebrush and distant lightning. Behind her, boots shuffled. She turned slightly. The young man had stood as well. He didn't speak, just followed her gaze to the dark horizon. The wind pulled at her hair. He reached out, gently brushed a few strands behind her ear. His hand hovered for a moment, not quite touching her cheek, then fell away. They didn't speak. There was no need. Inside, the fire burned lower, but it still burned. Morning crept in slow, soft, and gray. The storm had passed sometime in the deepest hours of the night, leaving behind a damp hush that blanketed the hills and soaked the earth in. Silence. Mist clung to the grass like ghost breath, curling around the fence posts and hanging low in the hollows. Birds had not yet returned to their songs. Even the wind had quieted, as if nature itself was catching its breath. Mara stood at the window, arms folded across her chest, watching the Comanche ready their horses. The 7 figures moved with quiet precision, saddling, strapping, checking hooves and stirrups. There was no rush, but there was purpose in every movement. Their time here was done. Shelter was never more than borrowed. She didn't know how she felt about that. Inside the cabin, everything looked untouched. The fire had burned down to coals. The stew pot was empty. The borrowed blankets were folded neatly at the edge of the table. They had taken nothing, not even more space than needed. Just warmth. Just stillness. Mara hadn't slept much. After the stories, after the shared silences, she'd sat awake beside the fire while Boone lay with his head in her lap. She didn't think she'd spoken aloud, but somewhere in the night, the young one, Cohote, she'd learned, had brought her a cup of water, then sat beside her for a long while, not touching, not asking. Just there, and that presence, that simple, silent presence, had calmed something inside her she didn't know still stirred. Now, as dawn broke like a whisper through the mist, they were preparing to leave. She stepped outside barefoot, arms bare against the morning chill. Dew soaked her nightdress at the hem, but she didn't feel it. The earth was soft beneath her feet. The leader, Tala, was mounting his horse when he saw her. He nodded once, deep and solemn, and she returned the gesture. "You gave us peace," he said. "Even for a night. That has weight." Mara said nothing. Her throat was tight. The others were already mounted, turning their horses slowly toward the road that disappeared over the hills. All except one. Cohote stood by his horse, reins loose in his hand. He looked at her across the yard, and this time, he did smile, just a little. It wasn't flirtation or promise. It was something deeper, like recognition. He stepped toward her, slow and careful, until only a breath separated them. Mara looked up into his face, the calm there, the steadiness. She wanted to ask him to stay. She almost did, but she didn't. She couldn't. Not because she didn't want him to, but because the kind of man who came to your door in a storm and didn't ask for more than a roof, that kind of man had to choose it for himself. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled something out. Small, smooth, carved from dark wood. He placed it in her palm. A hawk in flight, wings wide, head turned, forever circling. She closed her fingers around it, and he stepped back. He mounted his horse with the same grace she'd seen in everything he did. Boone barked once, but it wasn't a warning. It sounded almost like farewell. Cohote didn't look back as he rode off with the others. She stood there for a long time after they disappeared into the mist. Days passed, then weeks. The hawk sat on her windowsill. She touched it every morning, not quite knowing why. The cabin felt different now. Not fuller, not louder, just less empty. And then one evening, when the sky had turned copper with sunset and the prairie grasses waved like fire, she heard hooves again. Just one horse this time. She stepped outside, heart thudding in her chest. Cohote sat astride a painted mare. He had another behind him, riderless. He said nothing at first. Just looked at her, same calm eyes, same quiet presence. And then he spoke. This time, he said, "I seek shelter not from the storm, but for the years ahead. Mara stared at him, the wind catching her hair, her breath caught somewhere in her chest. She didn't speak either. She didn't have to. She just stepped aside, and made room for him to ride in.